Hi, can you hear me? Hi, and
Oh, sorry, you can.
I need to be able to share my screen. If you can enable that.
How do we enable sharing screen?
Okay.
We're just organizing that for you now, Michael.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I think we can.
Oh, I feel.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. So my name is Michael Sladnick. I'm from Chicago, and last year I moved over to the Thai-Myanmar border area. I'm currently in the Myawaddy area. That's where there's been big battles happening the last few months for control of the city, the regime being pushed back and trying to counterattack. So I got involved in the revolution over there and have been active here. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about a recent trip I took to another nearby border area, to Karenni, which is an area that is close to liberation. So we visited a lot of the current battlefronts and liberated areas. I went there with a journalist. I organized between them the local revolutionaries and translated for them. So before I talk about that, I have a lot to say about the Spring Revolution in general and a little bit about my involvement over the past 3 years. So let me just start this. So I was a leftist for a long time in the US, and I became a leftist because I believed that this wave of globalization that was happening over the last decades was building up these dictatorships around the world, but also industrializing and creating a new international working classes around the world, and that we had to look forward to their uprisings and prepare for them. So I was always following different revolutions happening around the world. And when the coup happened in Myanmar, I didn't really expect much of it because I knew that this was a country that had repeated revolutions which are crushed and finally achieved a very weak democracy, which had a genocide and very little pushback against that genocide. So I had no connection with Myanmar. I'd never been there. I didn't know any Burmese people, but I did not think that this would succeed. And the past revolutions were started by students, or the one in 2007 by monks. And this one got started differently. It started with the public sector workers, here teachers. A few days after the coup, they went on strike against it. Other public sector workers, here medical workers, train workers, public employees, all said they're not going to work under the coup regime. And then this spread to the factories. So the decade of semi-democracy in Myanmar saw all this export-oriented garment and other low-wage labor factories, staffed largely by migrants from the countryside, from the villages. Myanmar is still predominantly a rural country. So these largely female migrant workforce, they started to protest against the coup. Meetings were happening, and they decided to join the strike against it. And they really built, it was from these factories that they built a general strike. They pushed for a general strike. And that's how by the middle of February, mass protests grew out of this working class movement. And in Yangon and other big cities, you saw the immense demonstrations break out. So the regime, the military dictatorship, tried to crack down, and people fought back bravely. This is one of the largest militaries in the world, and people in the cities did everything they can to fight back. They built barricades in different cities to prepare to confront the police and the soldiers, and led the resistance from those barricades, defending the protests with homemade weapons like these. So the protests kept going on, starting to arm themselves. And they knew that the time was urgent. So at the same time as the protests were continuing, they're pushing to spread the revolution. The 3-finger salute that came from Thailand protests for the year before. So they were trying to spread this into an Asian spring. And here you see protesters marching. That's the Chinese border gate, trying to spread the protest for democracy to China. So the regime eventually cracked down to this. They upped their force. They cracked down brutally, using real ammunition, shooting into the crowd, shooting at the barricades, blowing them up with bombs. And many martyrs were lost. You know, people, these young people, this generation who had vowed to fight for democracy, lost thousands of people. You know, this was all within a 2-month period. You see, from having a normal life to protesting, to being on the barricades, to being a martyr. And in particular, they cracked down on the factory district, Hlengthea in Yangon. They slaughtered hundreds of these shop floor union activists, especially women, you know, factory activists. And it seemed at that point like the revolution could be defeated. That was at the point when the mass media, Myanmar basically mostly dropped out of the headlines. And in the past, these past revolutions, the regime had cracked down like that and the revolution had been defeated. You had some people like in 1988 starting to go up to the hills to try to fight back, but that might have been it, just a small number of people going to join fight in the hills. But this time was different. Myanmar had changed a lot. And just as it was falling out of the headlines, and you know, the urban movement was facing oppression, an even larger and more powerful movement was just beginning. And you know, throughout, as the crackdown is happening in the cities, people are flowing out of them. Hundreds of thousands of people, this migrant rural workforce is going back to their villages. These women factory workers and other activists, and they're starting to mobilize the population there. So, you know, you could see here, these women activists leading in the cities, people saw this as themselves. They were their sisters, their brothers, their cousins, their friends who were in the cities leading this protest. And there was a huge explosion of anger when that crackdown happened on the working class in the cities. And meetings started to be held. And this erupted into huge mass movement. So, you know, the rural areas of Myanmar had sat out of all past revolutions. They had not participated. And this time, when the regime tried to crack down, they sparked for the first time in Myanmar's history this huge upheaval of the masses in the countryside. And you had in these quiet little towns where nothing ever happens, you know, that no one has ever heard about and no one visited, huge demonstrations breaking out everywhere. You know, so this was as things were already, you know, being crushed in the cities. And the mobilization to this went down to every village in the country. It went down all the way to the grassroots. And, you know, these people from every village, they had working class, everyone on the internet. So they were all plugged into what was happening this time. And it spread to the minority areas. You know, Myanmar is dozens of different ethnic groups. And the protests, even after the urban crackdown, you saw in all these minority areas, people still protesting, still rising up where they could. And even there, you know, it was the working class that was at the head of this movement. These women and other, you know, people with experience in the factories, in the urban protests were coming back to the countryside and leading the protest there, leading it in the small towns. And teachers, you know, also rural teachers unions. Teachers, the civil disobedience movement strike said that they're going to refuse to work under the regime. They spread to those areas. And students, most students across the country also stopped attending classes from kindergarten through university, and up to the present day, that is still the case. You know, a lot of other areas that had some industry, like here miners, they were centers of this uprising, and it swept across the countryside. So this was a really liberating moment. You know, that the world was missing. They had stopped paying attention to Myanmar, but there was this movement of these people who had never fought back before, for the first time standing on their feet and saying they're not going to go back to dictatorship. And it was at this time that I really realized that something historic was happening here. This was not just another movement that was going to, you know, pop up with all this hope and expectation and then get crushed and disappear. People were, you know, I was already starting to meet people from Myanmar on Facebook. Everyone's on Facebook, and they were saying, you know, we have history of this. We have had many failed revolutions, so we know what it's going to take. It means to fight against the military. It's not going to be easy, but this time we can't give up. We're going to fight. So, it's at this time that I really said, I got to find some way to support them, whatever that takes. And the regime started to crack down on these rural protests too. But when they did, people fought back. They started to assemble, thousands of groups or all over in different areas, thousands of self-organized autonomous groups getting together, young people, a whole generation of young people with no arms, starting to make homemade bombs, homemade guns, training themselves to fight back. And you can see here, so, just as the world was ignoring Myanmar and the middle class and the rich who hated the coup, were giving up and feeling hopeless. You had this rural proletariat, this Gen Z, flocking to the banner of the revolution, saying they're going to fight for it. And, going with whatever homemade weapons they have to fight it. And you could see what type of people these were who were fighting, what type of guns they have. This is one of the, the captured from one of the first big battles in the middle of the country, this heartland of the uprising. Normal people, men and women. These are, PDF, People's Defense Forces taken a prisoner of war. They're regularly tortured in prison. And the regime releases these pictures. They don't care about public image. They release picture of this of captives giving the 3-finger salute. They don't expect you to consent to the rule. They don't have propaganda. You just have to submit. So despite losing many people, despite that, not having weapons to fight back, the resistance took over a large area of the country. And you can see this map, the red and the blue areas controlled by resistance forces and ethnic insurrection. In fact, the red area should be much larger. The resistance controls most of the countryside. It's just very difficult to map. So even, this is my wife here. She was working in Yangon at the time. And, when there was the fight back in her native area was successful, she went back. She had confidence. She wanted to fight the regime. And you had a new wave of people going back, giving up their careers, going to fight. You had other people going up to the borderlands, the jungles, to join the ethnic minority groups. And the ethnic minority armies expressing confidence in the revolution, saying they're going to fight on the side of it. They're going to put their future in it. And that resistance kept the protest movement going, the civil protests in the countryside. In any area where they're able to organize, they kept protesting. So it wasn't just an armed struggle. You had demonstrations continuing every single day all over Myanmar for months and months after it disappeared from the headlines and the urban protests were crushed. And these were organized by strike committees, totally self-organized, no one directing them, all over in local areas. Young generation of people and, giving speeches every day, organizing protests, rallying, their support for the revolution and, organizing, mobilizing the communities as part of it. You had, people who experience with the unions continuing to be active in that. And their message they were trying to put out, these protests, was one of that this revolution was a consequence of Myanmar's history to fail. When the regime was oppressing, the military was oppressing all these different ethnic groups. Burmese people, the dominant group, had failed to stand up for it. So you had this idea that now the regime was oppressing everyone because they failed to stand up for the oppressed. So a lot of these protests, their themes were, liberation, support for the oppressed. And in the heartland of the country, there's not many ethnic and religious minorities, but, LGBT in these rural areas were very prominent of standing at the head of demonstrations. And, in rural areas, mining districts, solidarity demonstrations with LGBT, with women's rights, other groups. Dressing children in drag as a show of respect. Some of the people dressed like that are also, LGBT themselves. And these protests were a safe haven from activists from the cities who wanted to keep doing the above ground protests, keep doing protests, able to go there and spread their message. So, I dedicated myself to trying to support these people who kept doing the protests. Burmese people all over the world were fundraising, crowdfunding to support the resistance. And, I felt that the civil resistance was also really important, not just the armed resistance. And I spent, every day for months and months, and eventually started to make contact with these people, these activists who were leading these demonstrations around the country. And, most of them don't speak English. So I had to learn Burmese in the process of supporting them and raising funds for them. Because you had all these young people, they're not part of any organization. There's no one directing them. And they're often from the poorest parts of the country, the poorest elements from their village. They're the young people who stood up in this revolution, dedicated themselves to it, were rising up as young, proletarian grassroots leaders. So these people need support. The middle class, the richer people in Myanmar were afraid to support them, afraid to donate, they can get arrested. So as an international supporter, I saw, if I don't support them to keep doing this revolution, then what support will they get? And also, small number of people who bravely kept doing protests in the cities, donating to them so they can have safe houses and continue to be active there. So this area I was talking about, I was focusing in my online work. That's this area in red in the middle of the country, Anya. And I was especially focusing on the black circle within that where a lot of the protests were happening. And by mid-2023, my Burmese was good enough just from doing that work and talking to them every day online that I wanted to come to the region and do more. I really felt lucky to be able to meet these people, know these incredible people, to support them. So I came down to that green area down there, the Thai-Myanmar borderland, to try to work with activists from the ground. And my trip I'm going to tell you about now is in this blue area in the middle, another borderland area, Karenni. That I took a journalist who is very active on bringing news about the ongoing resistance gains against the military on Twitter. And he wanted to report from the actual situation on the ground so people on Twitter can know about that, can get the actual insight from the people. So Karenni is a lot like the area that I had experience with. It is an area which was one of the centers of the mass movement in 2021. These mass protests erupted. And, unlike the other pictures I showed you of, which were from Burmese, Bamar ethnic areas, Karenni is very multi-ethnic, very diverse, different ethnic groups, different religions, many different languages. But it was another center of this protest movement. And it was also the first area where people really started to fight back, where the regime focused on them at the beginning and tried to crack down. And here you see them destroying a police station. And they fought back in May, June 2021 against that crackdown with whatever homemade weapons they have, organizing across ethnic lines as part of the Spring Revolution to fight back. So, despite that difficult starting point of not having arms, now you see the map here, they've almost completely liberated Karenni. There's only a few regime holdouts left remaining. So we wanted to go there and see what the situation is. And Karenni, it's an extremely beautiful landscape. But after 3 years of revolution, it's been devastating. There's destruction, ruins everywhere. You see here cities, the regime specifically targets, civilian areas, drive-away civilians, trying to punish them for doing the revolution. It's being pushed back by the resistance and takes it out on civilians. And in the rural areas as well, there's not a single village in all of Karenni State that has not been bombed. Everywhere we went, ruins, burned down villages, destruction everywhere. And the people of Karenni are largely relegated to refugee camps, hiding in ravines. Women, children, the elderly. So these refugee camps, people, even if their areas have been liberated, they can't return to them. When the regime was occupying their areas, they planted bombs in their housing. So when people come back, they're blown up. They continue to target them with drone strikes to terrorize civilians. And the land is all fallow. They don't have support to come back and reestablish their economy and start living again. On the Thai side of the border here, we saw huge, enormous abandoned refugee camps where tens of thousands of Karenni people have been. And the Thai government forced these people back across the border into the fire zone with no assistance. Internet is cut off on these areas. There's very few news reports about what's happening. They have difficulty even contacting other Burmese people for support. So you have people living in these shelters. They don't even have proper rain covers. That's not waterproof. With the monsoon season a few months away, all they have to eat is rice, cooking oil, no onions, nothing to protect them from the rains, not even malaria medicine, for when they get sick. And it was these people who have sacrificed everything for democracy through their own efforts, despite not getting support. They have fought back and taken control of most of Karenni, liberated most of it. The, sisters and brothers and mothers and fathers of the people in the camps are the ones on the front lines fighting. And they're doing their best to support the refugees at the same time as they're dependent on the civilian population for support. It's, there's many different groups. They all have to crowdfund for themselves. They're all dependent on local contributions. So you see here, fighting in urban battlefields, they don't just have flip-flops. They can't even afford to choose real uniforms. Despite that, they've continued to make major gains. So here in Messe in the south, Messe police station, which was liberated a few months ago. It was the last holdout of the regime in the south of the state. And PDFs, besieged it and took it over a few months ago to liberate the southern area. Over 20 police died in the battle. Their uniforms and their bulletproof vests are still in the rubble, and turned at least the south of Karenni into a refuge for these civilians. So here we visited a mountain camp of the regime that was just taken a few weeks before we arrived. Almost 100 regime soldiers died there in the capture. The PDFs, the revolutionaries, successfully captured it. In the past, their corpses were still laying on the ground. In the last picture, you can kind of see one, and there, the commander's corpse. A lieutenant commander, that's his badge, came from him. So the regime is suffering major losses. That's the second last camp the regime holds in the mountains. Now the PDF is moving on to the last one. Here, with this lack of support, they have the whole population trying to fight back, but they have major limitations. So here, a major bridge they just captured also a few weeks before we arrived. And when they use the guns and ammunition they have to take those, every battle they face, because they don't have outside support, after they take a position, they have to stockpile, spend a long time stockpiling ammunition before they're ready for the next battle, to assault the next point. And in the meantime, have to expend all these resources to feed everybody, to care for the refugees. And, everyone kept saying if they just got outside support, these last few battles could be over immediately. They just don't have enough ammunition to finish it. So, how it was there, the way these groups are organized is everywhere we went, every different base we visited, every camp had multiple different groups, like 4 or 5 different groups sharing one base. And these are people from all different areas, all different languages. So in addition, the Karenni ethnic group is like 10 or 12 different groups. They all speak different languages. In addition to that, there's many Shan people in Karenni that's related to Thai. There's Burmese people. There are Karen people. So a very diverse area, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and they're all organized in these different groups. And everywhere we visited had many different groups working together. Under the chain of command, under the NUG's chain of command, but not really receiving any support from the NUG. All these battles I just showed you, the police station, the bridge, they took that with their own resources, not with NUG money. So they loyal to the NUG, but the NUG has no one there, no officials to control them. These are just normal people who are organizing to fight back and organize into all these different groups, but coordinating, all working together. So sharing drones drones, a lot of them they built themselves, are very important for these battles to give them a fighting chance. All these different groups, different ethnic groups share drones together. Here's from a cooking camp. They share single cooking camps, places cooking for all the different groups. And also bringing in, this is from a regime base that defected a few months ago. We stayed there at night. So the soldiers joined, you can see they're pointing in the guest house. Min Online's picture is still on the walls there. Visiting there was the one time going into that, I was a little afraid on the trip. But here, a soldier who defected from the military dictatorship to the base who let us in. He has 3 sons all fighting in the resistance. So when I heard that, I was more at ease. And different EAOs here, KNPLF, that was kind of a EAO, an ethnic armed insurgent group, which had an agreement for decades with the regime. Just a few months ago, they joined. They went over to the side of the revolution, and we saw them all working together with the PDFs. So, the form of organization that we saw, that I have also experienced working with the middle of the country, these areas with the other resistance and the protests, is there's a symbolic belief in a democratic government, the NUG. But the NUG doesn't really do anything. It's not funding these groups. It's not controlling them. So people just have a symbolic belief in democracy and democratic values. And with that belief and that dedication to fight back, they're able to organize themselves into all these dozens and hundreds of thousands of autonomous groups, which have their self-organization, but are all able to cooperate with each other because they are all dedicated to democracy and social justice. And everyone we talk to has said, that's what we're fighting for. We're not fighting for this to get anything for ourselves. We just want our rights back. And we're not just fighting for Karenni. After Karenni, we're going to go on and fight for Naypyidaw, for the capital, the regime capital, which is nearby Karenni, and that this is part of a global struggle against fascism. So there's me in Pasang, which is a major city where the battles are happening now. I'm able to go up right to the front lines. The regime is surrounded, besieged in their last base there. There's me again in village with some PDF. At the Messe police station, and that's the journalist we took who was doing the reporting from there. You see displaying the regime flag, the hated Myanmar dictatorship flag of the old fake democratic constitution. So, I believe that this is these people are on the front lines of a global struggle against dictatorship, against the rising forces of fascism. And it's important for us to support them. They need the left support. There's nobody else helping these people. And even, people who have better jobs, who have money, who are wealthy in Myanmar are afraid to support them. So it's the working class people and the poor who are on their own. For the past 3+ years, no government, no NGO has helped them. And they are just, dependent on if they got that help, they would make the biggest difference. They kept saying over and over again, if they just had a little more money to buy ammunition, then they would really be able to liberate Karenni for people fleeing the military draft who are starting to arrive, for all different ethnic groups, and turn it into a base to bring this revolution to the next level. So, I encourage people to do what you can to support the Myanmar Spring Revolution. And, I did it by meeting my local Myanmar community, Myanmar people all over the world. They're the ones who are funding this and keeping the struggle going. So talk to Myanmar people at that meeting and from wherever you're from about how to get involved. And, if you would like another way to donate, you can go to this Facebook page. We are doing a campaign to raise that support for Karenni, right directly for the people on the front lines we met. And it's been a very difficult last month here since I returned. In the Karenni State, the Myawaddy area, the resistance temporarily liberated the city and then had to retreat because there's a huge armored regime reinforcement column, which is still coming. So You know, we've been occupied here, but we are still launching that support campaign and continuing support for the strike committees and everyone else. So again, this is a very powerful revolution, and I'm constantly dumbfounded by the lack of attention it's getting from the mainstream media and from activists around the world. So I'm very thankful for all of you who attended here today, who are showing interest and support of Myanmar. And thank you all for the opportunity for me to speak and for listening to me.
It's so much fun.
Thank you so much. My name is Katrina here at House Conspiracy, which is an organizing space here in Brisbane. And we've got a really beautiful group of activists here who have listened and really taken on board what you said. So thank you so much.